So you see the continents look like they fit together. The third thing, the thing that we're looking at now, is the fact that you can tell the environmental deposition of sedimentary rocks. Also, sedimentary rocks are of note because they're the only rock that contains fossils. And in this picture, you're looking at the distribution of 4 organisms, 1 plant, 3 animals, as they are today. If you dig down in these geographic locations, you find these animals. For the purposes of the quiz, you don't need to know the names of the organisms, but just understand what's going on here. So first at the bottom here, we have the freshwater reptile called Mesosaurus. And Mesosaurus is an organism that can be in water, right? So it's conceivable that if you put Africa and South America where they are today, this organism could swim, except it's adapted to fresh water, so it would quickly dry out. And this organism is found in a continuous distribution across the south of South America and Africa. Similar, but up geographically north a little more, you have the fossil remains of an organism called Cygnognathus. Cygnognathus is a terrestrial organism, and they are found in continuous distribution in that darker gray. Lystrosaurus, found in, there's Madagascar right there, found on these 4 land masses. And then perhaps most compelling is the fossil fern. It's kind of a proto-fern, the fossil fern called Glossopteris. And Glossopteris is found, as you can see, in a continuous distribution across 5 continents plus Madagascar. And I call this a proto-fern because if we're talking about the ferns of today, their seeds, their spores are quite small. So it's conceivable that they could be carried long distances on the wind and they could colonize different continents. However, this fern had very large seeds, about the size of a small apple. So those seeds would drop straight down as the seed ripened and started to germinate. So we have this distribution of fossils. And you have to ask yourself, what is the probability that these organisms all could have evolved independently without any sort of genetic connection back through time and became identical genetically? There's no such thing as 0 probability. That's about as close as you get, though. So the point here is that this map shows that sedimentary rocks support the fact that, that's a terrible blinking, support the fact that these continents used to be together. Now we're looking at igneous and we're looking at metamorphic rocks. And we looked at these from a cursory point of view a couple of classes ago. The green is igneous rock, and the dots are just sampling points. So the igneous rock that's here, just like organisms have a genetic signature, igneous material has a specific sort of chemistry that you can tell from where it originated. And these 5 green blobs, all, as it turns out, came from a common source. So there was a plume of magma that came up, burned its way through the crust. It's all from the same source. And if you look at that top part there, that little area right where the dashed line is, that's actually Florida. And there is a piece of Africa wedged under Florida right now. So you have this fossil evidence, you have igneous rock evidence, and the yellowish stuff is metamorphic rocks. We ended looking at rocks with our discussion of metamorphic rocks, and we said, remember that these rocks are folded and faulted. And so the interesting thing here is that not only do they have the same chemistry and the same patterns, but if you go to the east coast of South America and you're looking at this pattern of folding, and you go across the ocean, you pick up the continuation of that folding in Africa. So this yellowish band is all mountain belts that were once together. So you see these rocks are very interesting from the point of view of telling the story that Wegener wanted to tell, simply that the continents were once all together. His 4th line of evidence, Paleoclimatic evidence. This is paleo, just means old. Is this on? Yeah. Paleo, old, climatic. You're looking at the history of climate on Earth in this picture. And if you go to a part of the landmass that is in green here, what you find is tropical material, so tropical swamp plants, etc. You find sedimentary rocks that were laid down in a tropical environment. And if you look at this, in some cases that makes sense, right? The northern part of Africa and South America, the southern part of North America. But in other places, it's not really something that makes sense anymore. And we'll talk about convection cells in the atmosphere, and we'll talk about how there are these bands of tropical and then desert, and then you move to temperate, boreal, and then to glacial regions. Beneath and above the tropical material, you find rocks that are sedimentary rocks that are indicative of deserts. And you see the dots here, things like desert dune deposits and evaporate deposits. Evaporate deposits are places where seawater has evaporated so quickly because it's so arid and sunny there that the salts are left behind. And then the last part of this picture, again, this is all in the sedimentary rock record, is glacial material. And that should make sense to you, right? Antarctica is covered with a glacier. But that glacier once existed in a continuous distribution, as evidenced by scratches and also by sediment, into South America, Africa, India, and Australia. So that was once a continuous glacier. And the blue dots are kind of neat. Those are ice-rafted boulders. As we'll see when we look at rivers and flooding, water is a very good sorter of sediment, but it's a very poor carrier. So when you have a river that's flowing, you can back into the speed of the river just by picking up the sediment, seeing what size particle it is. Glaciers are the opposite. They're very good carriers, but they're poor sorters. So a glacier can carry a giant boulder and a piece of clay with equal ease. And so those ice-rafted boulders were a mystery to geologists for a long period of time. You find these boulders on land and then also in the ocean, and there's no way that ocean currents could carry giant boulders the size of a house. And there was actually someone who postulated that these were left by aliens. So there was just no other physical mechanism by which this could happen until you start looking at this and you see that what was happening is the glacier was carving its way up through the bedrock underneath this region, and then icebergs would calve off and would float towards the northern area, towards the equator. And as it floated northward, an iceberg would melt and drop out its sediment. And so big boulders are on the seafloor as a result of this huge glacier. So again, to recap, Wegener was thinking that all the continents were together. His evidence was the fit. It looks like they fit together. Sedimentary evidence, meaning fossils and climate. And then igneous and metamorphic evidence, meaning the chemistry and the folding and faulting. So Wegener wrote this book and expected to revolutionize the field of geology. So have I convinced you of this? Or I didn't do anything, I'm just telling you what he did. Are you convinced? Does it seem compelling, this evidence? Yeah? So he thought he was going to, again, revolutionize the field of geology. However, physicists are the scientists that sit in their lab and pose largely mathematical laws. Physics, right? The mathematical laws for how things happen and why things happen, and they test this. And so there was a physicist by the name of Harold Jeffreys. It's IES, sorry. So Harold Jeffreys. And he wrote a rebuttal paper, and I'm being sort of colloquial about this. However, this was going on in scientific literature, back and forth response papers. Harold Jeffreys said, that's all very well and good. However, I don't care how many fossils you collect and cute little pieces of metamorphic rock, you have failed in this theory because you failed to provide a mechanism. You haven't given a reason, a physical process that would cause large blocks of continental landmass to plow through the ocean rocks. There's no way that this could happen. So Wegener was not daunted, and he wrote his response paper, and his response paper had to do with this picture. What is this picture? What is this a picture of? Specifically the blue stuff on Earth. Water, yep, so what's going on? What does the moon do to the water on Earth? Tides, excellent, yeah. So our last class we talked about gravity, right? Gravitational pull of the moon, and to a lesser extent the sun, on Earth causes it to deform ever so slightly But the hydrosphere, the liquid portion of Earth, is very deformable, and it follows 1.36 billion cubic kilometers of water follow the moon around Earth. And so Wegener said the same thing that causes the tides, colossal amounts of water moving around like that, slowly through time, and we didn't have radiometric dating back then, so he didn't know any sort of time scale, slowly through time pulled the continents through the ocean rocks. Harold Jeffreys wrote a response paper that said, well, that's all very well and good, Wegener, but in order for the moon's pull, gravitational pull, to be sufficiently strong to pull rock through rock, Earth's rotation would have stopped in a few tens of thousands of years. And since we know from many different sources that not only has the Earth's rotation not stopped, it's also not slowed down appreciably, that couldn't have been. So at this time, Wegener, remember he's a meteorologist by training, he got asked to go up to Erschmitt, which is a foul weather research, extreme weather research station in Greenland. He got asked by a colleague to go help set it up and get it going. And being a good friend, he said, sure, I will. And he got to Greenland, and the weather was so bad that everyone in his party turned back except him and his assistant. And they were walking, pulling this sled that was filled with equipment, but also supplies for the people that were at the station. And he got there. It took a couple of days to walk in, and he helped set up the station. And then he said, all right, I have to go back. And they said, you shouldn't go because the weather's really bad, just wait a couple days. And he said, well, I don't want to dwindle your supplies because who knows when you're going to get more, but also I think I have it. I think I have the mechanism. Walking here, I think I figured it out. I think it has to do with, instead of something from above, it has to do with something from below. There has to be some sort of liquid that's beneath us that's causing the continents, he didn't know about plates, to move. And so they said, okay, go ahead. And he went back ready to write up his paper. So this is the tides part. And of course, you know what happens to our underdog hero. Did he get back to his station? No. He, very sadly, he didn't come back. And this was all in the New York Times. It was headlines all the way through this whole drama. They thought they spotted him, and then they didn't, and they did, and they didn't. They finally found his body had frozen. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest and hypothermia combined. So poor Wegener died without knowing that of the hundreds of thousands of geologists who seek to revolutionize our field in small and large ways, he is one of the few people we teach in these intro classes because he had the most profound impact on how we view Earth, what Earth processes are all about, and how these disasters happen. So he was not well received, and it was sad. He passed away, and then several decades went by. Everybody was all too happy to forget about him. And then we fast forward to the 1950s. And this is a summary slide, so I have a slide on each one of these. So if you're writing down, don't worry about trying to write these down. The point to this slide is that in the 1950s and 60s, we started to have instruments, radar, sonar, and all sorts of other instruments that enabled us to look at Earth and look at the oceans in different ways. And we also became very interested in Earth's magnetic field, what it is, how it comes about, and what it does for us. So the point to this slide, these are 7 different things. There were different teams of scientists and even the military studying these things, and they were not thinking that they were related. These are just people studying Earth. So we'll look at each one of these in first their unrelated way, and then we will move along to see how they could possibly be related and are related. So first, paleomagnetism, just like paleoclimate, it's old magnetism. This was discovered in a very interesting way. The United States Navy, during the Cold War, right, this time of increased tension between the Soviet Union and the United States, thinking that nuclear war was about to break out at any moment, the United States Navy was dragging magnetometers. Magnetometers are designed to detect variations in magnetic field behind their vessels. And the point was that they're looking for a submarine. And if there was a variation in the magnetic field, you know that there's a metal object that's passing. There's some magnetic disturbance. So this vessel was going across the ocean, and it left and started after a couple hundred miles. You had the magnetometer switch to reverse polarity. You kind of think about it as a compass, but it detects magnetic field variations. And it switched, and it was all high drama. Alarms went off, all hands on deck. Oh gosh, a Russian submarine is here. And everybody was ready, manning their stations. But the magnetometer stayed in reverse polarity for a long time. For way too long. There's no way that a submarine would be that big. So they concluded that there was just a problem with the magnetometer. The technician was called in to try to fix the magnetometer as they're going. And then it went back to normal polarity. And he said, well, I don't know what happened, but it's fixed now. And the same thing kept happening every so often. The technician couldn't fix it, alarms, high drama, magnetometer stayed switched for too long. And they finally said, all right, we are going to go back because obviously this magnetometer is not working and we need to get a new magnetometer. But the thing is, there wasn't just one vessel from the Navy going around the ocean looking for submarines. There are many. And guess what? They were all reporting back. We have to come home because our magnetometer is broken. So it was determined, and Vine and Matthews took this over later, geologists, it was determined that it's not broken magnetometers, that there are actual stripes on the seafloor. And not, so what I want you to look at first is just this picture here. I'm going to come back to these and we'll look at horizontal versus vertical sequences. There are a set of stripes going across the seafloor, not in different colors, but they're stripes of normal polarity, reverse polarity, normal polarity, reverse polarity. And they're different widths. And the interesting thing about these is also that they match up. There are, if you look at this, this is time 2 right here with the blue in the middle and gray on the sides. And then as you move forward, you have gray. So gray would be normal polarity. Now the green would be reverse polarity. And you see as the time goes past, you have these matching reverse polarity episodes that we'll look at. But for now, the point of paleomagnetism is simply, don't have to get bogged down in this, again for the purposes of the quiz, there are stripes on the seafloor. That's it. There are magnetic stripes on the seafloor. For now, we'll say we have no idea why. This is always a little bit tricky to try to teach because I present them sequentially, but really they're going on all at the same time. This research is going on more or less at the same time, so bear that in mind. People started to be interested in Earth's geomagnetic field, this field that protects us from harmful cosmic radiation, that allows us to navigate and does other things. And so this is a picture of our magnetic field. Do you see a typo here? Excellent. South and north are reversed. Only the thing is, that's not a typo. As we put these together, we'll realize that this is the key to paleomagnetism. We have a magnetic field, and every so often it goes away, so there'll be no magnetic field, and then it recreates itself, but it recreates itself in the opposite of what it was. So magnetic north would actually be at the South Pole. To jump to the kind of end of at least this story, because we're not going to go into a lot of detail about it, this is from very slow convection currents in the Earth's outer core. And this happens every 10,000 to several million years that the Earth's magnetic field reverses. Average is about 600,000 years. And it just goes away and comes back. Anyone see this terrible movie, The Core? So it's a good movie to watch if you haven't seen it, because this is exactly what happens. It starts out with this guy sitting on the Bay Bridge, I think in San Francisco, and he gets a solar flare. His arm burns, and then things start being catastrophic in the way that Hollywood dramatizes these things, but with the grounding in surprisingly sound science. In this case, in the movie The Core, again, this is an interesting thing to watch that's relevant to this class. It wasn't that the magnetic field was going away by itself. There were terrorists who stopped the magnetic field, and the United States had to go drive in a Jules Verne type machine to the center of the Earth and set off a bomb, a nuclear bomb, get it spinning again, and then outrun the shock wave. suspension of disbelief happens at about 3 minutes, but it's neat in that you do get to see these layers of Earth and the fact that they go in at the Mariana Trench where the lithosphere is the thinnest. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, it's a funny thing to watch. But yes, the Earth's magnetic field right now is going away, and it's going away at a faster rate every year. Should we be worried about this, right? Because it protects us from cosmic radiation, and organisms navigate using this, right? Sharks and all sorts of other organisms. Well, the point to answer the question, should we be worried? There are no mass extinctions, increased rate of species just dying off, that are correlated to a geomagnetic reversal. So it seems like we'll be fine. And we no longer navigate with compasses, right, except from a historical point of view, we use GPS, so we should be fine. But it's going away right now, and it has gone away every so often back through time. Another thing that several oceanographers were looking at, this is sort of a basic diagram so that you can see what's going on. Oceanographers were looking at the distribution of sediments on the seafloor. And what they were expecting to find was a continuous distribution of a thick series of sediments across the seafloor, all the way, so if you're in the Atlantic Ocean, from one spot to another. We geologists love seafloor sediments. It sounds boring, but it's fascinating. We call them the information superhighway to the past. Because remember that sediments and sedimentary rocks record a record of what's going on Earth. And so you have this constant weathering on Earth that's laying down with the oldest on the bottom and the youngest on the top, what had been going on Earth back for hundreds of thousands of years. So we wanted to unravel Earth's history by taking a research vessel, sending down on a cable a grab sampler, getting some sediment, bringing it up, opening the sampler, and looking at it. What has gone on? You can find fossils, you can find records of climate, you can find all manner of things. So these oceanographers are doing this, and they were getting frustrated. So let me explain this diagram. Here, on this side, you are in Boston, say, Woods Hole, oceanographers leaving from Woods Hole. They set out, and close to the continent, you have tens of hundreds of centimeters of sediment. And this stuff gets laid down very, very slowly. You see that the rate of accumulation is about 1 centimeter every 5,000 to 50,000 years. So it's a tiny amount of sediment that gets laid down every 1,000 years or so. So you have tens to hundreds of centimeters. So when you do the math, you could see that this is, 5 million years of record if you have 100 centimeters. But as they start going through the seafloor, closer and closer to the middle of the ocean, they would send the grab samplers way down, pull it up, and they were getting less and less sample. And when you get to the middle of the ocean, it's very disappointing for these oceanographers. They get out to the middle of the ocean, they send the grab sampler down, they come up absolutely empty. There's nothing there. So the seafloor sediment distribution, again, for the purposes of just understanding the bottom line with this, there is a wedge shape. And then you would turn this around if you're going from the center of the ocean, the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, over towards Europe. You'd have nothing, and then it would slowly get more and more and more and more until you get to hundreds of centimeters when you get over to the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. So you have these two wedges. And when you do the math, you have from millions of years to 0 years. So this is also something that we like to group up with seafloor spreading. Oceanographers from Woods Hole in the 1950s, again, people like Harry Hess looking at seafloor spreading. So now we get to start thinking about, start thinking about putting these all together. Again, we're looking at radar and sonar, and what is the seafloor doing in a way that we couldn't have done before? Some geologists thought that it was a big, flat, featureless basin, and others thought there was topography similar to what's on land. So there's mountains, there's valleys, there's all sorts of neat things on the seafloor. And so, again, radar and sonar made this possible. Taking swaths of the seafloor, what we realized was that, again, as you're at the edge of the Atlantic Ocean, or we'll say the Atlantic Ocean, you had the seafloor being flat and featureless. But as you get to the middle of the ocean, and this is coincident with there being 0 inches of sediment or centimeters of sediment, it starts to rise up. And the very interesting and bizarre thing about the Atlantic Ocean and other places, I'll show you the places where this is there's a chain of volcanic activity of volcanoes that stretches pretty much from the North Pole to the South Pole. One huge set of volcanoes that are higher than Mount Everest. And they're constantly volcanically active. This isn't back to time. This is right now. This is going on. They're constantly volcanically active. They are laying down new seafloor at the rate of about 11 centimeters per year. So this is it, and that depends on where you're going. So this is the point where we can start putting these things together. The seafloor, if you remember looking very briefly at basalt, which is the composition of most of the seafloor, has a mineral in it called magnetite. Magnetite is magnetic, right? And so what's going on here is that at the center of the seafloor, you have a volcanically active area. And the liquid is coming out. Remember, something is not a rock until it cools, right? The magnetite that starts cooling, you have these little crystals that are like compass needles. They're free to move around, but since they're magnetic, they all point towards the North Pole. And then when that rock cools completely, they get locked in place. It can no longer move. So as long as the North Pole has the magnetic north, those volcanoes that are spewing out lava have magnetite crystals that are pointing at the North Pole. And then the magnetic field goes away, so they're just pointing any old direction. It reforms, and now the magnetite crystals that are coming out of the ocean volcanoes are pointing towards the South Pole because that's now magnetic north. And as long as you have a geomagnetic reversal, those needles of magnetite, compass needles, will point towards the South Pole. And then it goes away, and you have it switch to the north again, and now they're all pointing to the north. So you see how we can put this together, the fact that there's a volcano that's laying down new seafloor, about 11 centimeters here. I'm going to go back up to this picture. That explains this. You already saw this, right? I said to just focus on this. Center of the ocean, you have new lava coming out, and they switch from north to south, and that tracks, that records the geomagnetic reversals. I can put a couple of animations on Canvas that you can look at if you're interested. The same thing actually happened on land. When people study, although we'll see how this is complicated in a couple slides, when people study volcanoes, you can actually see that there are geomagnetic reversals. But it's weird because you have lava coming out of a volcano, and as the lava is tracking, the geomagnetic reversal will come in the opposite direction and then this direction. So you have a vertical sequence rather than horizontal. But it's weird because it's not pointing true north, true south, true north, true south. It'll point off in different directions, over there, over there, over there, as it flips around. So on land, this is complicated somehow. You can look at how. So seafloor spreading has explained paleomagnetism. Again, we're back at the top slide. Paleomagnetism is the recording of Earth's magnetic field. And the fact that those volcanoes are constantly active means that the center of the ocean is 0 years old. And as you get to the edges of the ocean, you end up with millions of year old rock. And at 0 million at the center of the ocean, there has been no time for sediment to rain down onto it. And as it moves slowly across the seafloor, you have more and more sediment raining down on it. So you're recording how old that rock is simply by looking at the amount of sediment that's laying on top of the basalt. So there's seafloor spreading. 3 last things that people were also looking at. And I won't talk about this too much because we're going to look at hotspots a lot when we look at volcanoes. Hotspots. Lithosphere we'll define in a minute, but it's essentially, remember we said Earth's about halfway through its cooling history. And the crust in the uppermost mantle is cool, solid rock. And the stuff beneath it is very thick but capable of flow. For some reason that we don't fully understand, there are superheated plumes from either the outer core or the inner mantle that come burning up through the asthenosphere, which is not labeled here, don't worry, I'll show it to you in a minute, the plasticky part, and burns holes into the lithosphere. Hotspot volcanoes are created, and again, we'll look at this when we look at volcanoes. So you actually burn a hole through the crust, through the lithosphere, and you make a volcano. This is how Hawaii was formed. Hawaii is a chain of volcanoes, right? And this is a situation where there's a hot spot that's burning through the Pacific Ocean. So we started to look at, why is there a volcano here? There shouldn't be a volcano here. And we figured out that there are places on Earth, Iceland is another one, where there are hot spots. So again, we'll return to hot spots when we talk about volcanoes. The last two are apparent polar wander and then the distribution of earthquakes and volcanoes. So apparent polar wander is the phenomena that is used to explain why on land you don't have north, south in a simple pattern like you do on the ocean. You have over here, over here, over here, over here. Geologists studying, we'll start here in Africa, geologists studying rocks here, looking at the vertical sequence of lava flows, said, wow, North Pole is not always north. And this takes into account the reversal, so either north here or north down here. In reality, yes, there were these reversals, but also the pole wandered in this tight little S-curve on the top of Earth. No one had seen that before. Wow, the poles wander. And so people started looking at rocks elsewhere to see if they could duplicate this phenomena of the pole wandering around. So in the southwest of the United States, rocks were looked at. And the scientists essentially said, again, I'm being colloquial about this discussion, said, well, you're right, the pole did wander, but you're completely wrong about the direction of the pole wandering. Our rocks show that the pole wandered through that red track. And then in Europe and in China, they had places where we're looking at rocks. And in Europe, they said, oh, that's the blue part is where the pole wandered. So nobody's agreeing. And then the yellow one, you see, they converge after a while. So the green means that at least those two agreed. So it was a big mystery. Nobody could figure out where the poles wander. How could we have multiple poles? Because all the rocks would be, a mess. And it was at this point that someone said, remember that crazy guy Wegener from the 1910s who talked about how the continents were moving around? Just for laughs, let's get his maps of where he thought the continents were and where he thought they moved to. And when they did this, surprise, they got absolute agreement with all of the rocks. So what's happening is if you envision Earth here and the North Pole is here, but here's the United States, right, in its original position, the magnetite crystals will be pointing towards the North Pole. But then if you rotate the United States or North America, then the rocks that were coming out when it was here and the magnetite crystals are pointing like that, shifted that way. So it appears as if the pole is over here on the globe, and then if it moves northward and rotates a little more, those crystals get locked in place, so it looks like the pole is down there. So you see, it's simply a frame of reference question, right? The pole was always here. The magnetite crystals were tracing North America as it moved around. But if your perception is that North America was always here, then you can only conclude that it was the pole that moved. So apparent polar wander, what apparent means, it appears as if the poles moved, but in reality it was a continents. And when you take that frame of reference versus the fact that the pole was fixed, the continents were fixed rather, then you come up with a very different story. So apparent polar wander, it appears as if the poles moved, but in reality it was the continents. And that will explain the bizarreness of the geomagnetic reversal recordings. The last part of this is the distribution of earthquakes and volcanoes. People interested in lowering death and destruction as a result of natural disasters started studying the locations. We've done this for a long time, but really plotting it. where are earthquakes, where are volcanoes, where are tsunami? And it turns out, this is just a picture of earthquakes, but volcanoes are more or less superimposed on here. We'll look at hotspots as well, but more or less superimposed on, or sorry, more or less following these lines. Over here, where you have the Atlantic Ocean, there's that underwater volcano chain that stretches pretty much from the north to the South Pole. Constant volcanic activity. Associated with the seafloor spreading, new magma coming out and making new ocean crust, you have earthquakes. So you have volcanoes and earthquakes. This area here, the Pacific Rim, called the Ring of Fire, right? There are so many earthquakes and volcanoes in the Pacific Rim that people that live in this region have to come up with a lot of engineering and land use planning and all the things we talked about the first day of classes to live in the face of a huge number of earthquakes and volcanoes. Most active area seismically on Earth is the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. So you had these areas, there's Japan, we'll talk about Japan a lot, this tectonic mess of the convergence of 4 plates. So we're not at plates yet though. So the point here is that these phenomena, these natural disasters, mark the edges of the plate that move. So Wegener was wrong for 2 reasons. Number one, he failed to provide a mechanism. He didn't say how this happened, but also his notion that the continents were moving through the seafloor was wrong. So we'll look at those 2 things when we talk about plate tectonics. So this is where we're supposed to start Friday, but I'll go through 2 more slides or so that we have time for questions on Friday for the quiz on Monday. So plate tectonics describes the motion of these plates that comprise Earth's lithosphere, the rocky outer part, the crust, and the uppermost mantle. I'll show you a diagram of the lithosphere. So it's a different subdivision than we did the other day where we did core, mantle, crust. It is the rocky part, the crust, and the upper part of the mantle that's cool, that's solid. And so you'll see some pictures, but just to define this, the lithosphere is the solid part. Lithos means rock. The asthenosphere is this jelly-like, again, very, very thick, almost solid, but still capable of slow flowing. So that's what's happening. There is this rocky outer part of Earth that's broken into plates instead of being entire. And the reason that it's broken into plates is because there's movement, just like Wegener thought, beneath the plates that are causing these plates to move around, to come together, slam together, to pull apart from each other, making new crust, and then also to slide past each other, which is when we'll talk about earthquakes. Earthquakes really happen at all 3 of those situations, but here's a continuation of the definition of earthquakes, or sorry, plate tectonics. So you have these plates, they're moving around like bumper cars on the surface of Earth. And we'll look at the edges. We'll look at what the edges do. Again, they can pull apart, they can come together, they can slide past each other. And the reason that they do this is because, remember we talked about inside of Earth, and we said that the inside of Earth is hot, outside is cool. Where you have a differential of temperature, nature will seek to equalize out that gradient. So the hot stuff comes to the top, the cold stuff sinks down, and in response to that, the plates move around. So, though Wegener didn't get credit for this theory of plate tectonics, it is true, everything that he said, with certain exceptions. And this is a picture of the seafloor. Again, just focusing in on that chain of volcanoes. You have rock, and pay attention here to the age of these things. In general, the continents are older than the ocean, and the seafloor is very, very young, 0 to 200 million years old. That may sound old to you, but as a geologist, that's nothing, right? Because Earth is 4.6 billion years old, and you have only 0 to 200 million year old seafloor. So the seafloor is very young. Many parts of the continent are old, but both are significantly, significantly younger than the age of Earth. So we'll leave it here, a couple slides ahead, and we'll pick up on Friday, finishing up with plate tectonics. And if you think of it, bring questions that you may have for the quiz.